Okay, so in this video I'm going to go over for loops, and they're relatively easy once you've sort of gone over while loops. So last time we talked about how while loops, you have something that looks like this, right? So you start with while, then you have parentheses, and then you have your continue condition here. So you have your continue condition, and as long as it's true, this while loop will continue to keep running. Okay, let me switch back to black. And then we have braces. Okay. And so now you have the code that you want to run here. So all your code will be in here, so on and so forth, right? And then what are we forgetting here? So we're forgetting something that is actually very important, which is the counter. So let me actually, we'll use green, right? So we want to initialize some sort of variable, for example, I, that is the most common variable name for like a counter through a loop. And we want to, you know, we want to increment that counter down here at the end of the while loop. So this way we can count how many times we've gone through, right? And this can, this continue condition might be like, oh, uh, continue to run as long as I is less than 4, right? So something like that. So now, so now that we've gone through the while loop, let's sort of look at how the for loop is sort of similar. So a for loop looks like this. So you start with the for, right? And note how for each also started with 4. But this for loop is actually one of the more original ones, so one of the earlier versions. And for each didn't come about till later. But yeah, for loop, and basically we're just gonna sort of take all these elements in order. So essentially we want our sort of initialization of our counter here. Okay, and we keep that semicolon. We want our continue condition right over here, and then we can separate this. Let me color this black. And then lastly, we want our increment here. Okay, so this is really all a for loop is. Like, it really is just a reiteration of the while loop, but put in a very concise way like this. Okay, so now we close the parentheses, we open up some braces. Okay, so now we put our code that we want to repeat in here. And we no longer need that increment here because we have that right there. Okay, so how this for loop kind of runs is, and actually let me erase this part just so we can better see how things work. Okay, so I could put this here, I could put this right there. Okay, move these over here. All right. So now, essentially what we've done is just we've moved the initialization of the counter here, the continue condition. So as long as this condition is true, we're going to continue to run this for loop. And then we have some sort of an increment here. Okay. And so how this runs is when you first enter the for loop, just like how you first sort of, even before you enter the while loop, you initialize this counter variable up here, right? Okay. So you initialize that counter variable. Now, then in the while loop, it checks against this, well, now non-existent continued condition, and that's also what the for loop does. It checks against this continued condition, and if that's true, we go ahead and execute all the code here, right? And then, just like in the while loop, right? At the end of the code, we want to increment, and that's exactly what it does here. So then after running through all this code down here, we go ahead and increment, and then we come back up to the for loop because that's also what the while loop does, right? Okay, so this is really just the syntax of it. Let's see how it plays out. So I have the code from the previous video, and I've gone ahead and sort of um, removed all the comments. But here is our while loop, and you can see that here is our initialization. Let me counter initialization, and then we have our, let me actually tab multiple times. We have our continue condition here, and then we have our counter increment. Okay. So let's see how we can sort of refactor this into a for loop. And actually, before we do that, let's actually compile this and see how it runs. So if we go ahead and run this, right, last time we've said, all right, so basically we have 4 turtles in this array, right? And we want to go through each one of them in the array, and then we want to move it forward by 100, okay? So from index 0, which is the first turtle, and increment, 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 we do that for every turtle in this array. And it'll go up to index 3, and then once it hits index 4, since 4 is not less than 4, it's equal to 4, then it'll jump out of the while loop and stop executing there. And so this is the result that you see. Okay, so let's close that, and then let's do the same thing with the for loop. So the first thing we said, right, is we want for, and then what do we want to do next? Okay, so we want to copy this over, and then copy this over here. Okay, so we want our counter initialization first, and then what's next? Yeah, so this would be copying the continue condition over here. Okay, and then lastly, let's do the counter increment. Okay, so we don't need that last semicolon. These are just sort of to separate out these statements. And now we close the parentheses, we start the braces. Okay, and now it's saying variable index is already defined in method. Okay, so now it's saying, well, I already have index defined here, and I don't want to define that one more time. Okay, so let's actually keep that I, right? So the I sort of comes from index, and if we replace all these with I's, now it's not going to give us any more trouble. Okay, so now all we need is the body of the code or the for loop that we want to execute. And let me just comment these out. So we do that. Oh. Okay. And so now this is much more concise and easier to read. Okay. And now I want to replace that with I because I'm using that I counter. Okay. So let's compile this. Compile. Run this. Okay. And it does the same exact thing. Okay. So yeah, this is really it's really simple. Once you know while loops, you know for loops much more easily. You learn that much more easily. And so really the way that you sort of memorize and know how to do things is just by keep on practicing how to do these things. And I think in the next video I'll talk about some optimizations and things that we usually do to these for loops so that it becomes even more concise.